You're embarrassing us in front of the neighbors." That's what my son snapped at me, right there in my own driveway, in front of a dozen people I'd known for 20 years, because I'd made the mistake of mentioning a client delivery schedule at what was supposed to be a simple summer cookout. I didn't argue with him. I smiled, set down my paper plate, and walked back into my own house. He had no idea, not even the faintest idea, whose name was actually on the business he'd spent 5 years quietly acting like he already owned. Before I go any further, thank you for being here with me tonight. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, your city, your country, whatever corner of the world you're sitting in right now. A small note before we start. This story weaves in some fictional elements, for the sake of the telling. The names and the town aren't real, but everything underneath them happened close enough to true that I think it's worth telling. My name is Arthur Voss. I am 68 years old. I built a precision machining shop from a single rented garage bay into a company with 31 employees and contracts with 2 aerospace suppliers, and I want to tell you about the afternoon my only son told me I was an embarrassment in front of the neighbors, and about exactly what he didn't know he was standing on top of when he said it. I need you to understand something before this story really gets going. This is not a tale about a bitter old man settling a score. I am not bitter. I have learned, the hard way, that bitterness is what happens when a man swallows an insult instead of naming it plainly. What I felt that afternoon in my driveway was not bitterness. It was clarity, the specific, cold clarity of a man finally seeing a pattern he'd been looking directly at for years without letting himself name it. Let me take you back to the beginning, because you can't understand what happened in that driveway without understanding what I built before my son ever set foot in it. I married my wife, Linda, in the spring of 1981. I was 26, working the night shift at a machine shop 2 towns over, running lathes and mills for a man named Carl Duggan, who taught me everything I know about precision tolerances and honest invoicing, in roughly equal measure. Linda worked as a dental hygienist, and she had a way of looking at a problem and simplifying it down to its actual shape that saved me more headaches over the following 4 decades than I can count. We had our son, Bradley, in 1985. I remember holding him in the hospital, this small furious red-faced thing, and thinking, with the particular certainty new fathers get, that I would spend the rest of my life making sure he never wanted for anything. I want you to remember that thought, because it matters enormously to everything that happened later, and because I think it's the same thought that quietly ruins more fathers than almost any other single feeling in the world. I started Voss Precision Machining in 1988, out of a single rented garage bay on the edge of an industrial park, with one used manual lathe I'd bought at auction and a small line of credit Linda had co-signed against her own better judgment. I worked 80-hour weeks for the first 6 years. Linda kept the books at our kitchen table most evenings, the same way plenty of small business wives did in those years, and Bradley grew up largely in the back office of that shop, doing homework on a metal folding table while I ran parts on the floor 20 feet away. There is a story from those very early years I want to tell you, because I think it explains something about the man I was before any of this happened, and about the values I tried, imperfectly, to hand down to my son, even if only certain parts of those values ever fully took root. In 1992, 4 years into the business, we lost our single largest client without warning, a regional furniture manufacturer that represented nearly 40% of our revenue at the time, who abruptly moved their machining work to a larger shop across state lines that could offer a lower price per unit. I remember sitting at our kitchen table with Linda that evening, the ledger open between us, doing the arithmetic on how many months we could survive without that revenue, and the number was smaller than either of us wanted to say out loud. I did not lay off a single employee that year, though I came close to it more than once. Instead, I took on every job I could find, including several that barely covered our costs, simply to keep 4 families employed through a hard stretch, and I took no salary myself for 11 months, living instead off savings and, at one particularly lean point, a small loan from my own father that I paid back in full within 2 years, with interest he never once asked for. Linda had asked me once, that winter, why I was willing to run the company at a loss myself rather than simply cut 2 positions and protect our own margin. I remember my answer clearly, because I have repeated some version of it to myself many times since. Linda, I told her, those two men have families depending on that paycheck exactly the same way ours depends on this business. If I can absorb the hit myself before I make someone else absorb it first, that's the job. That's what running something honestly actually means. I tell you this story because I want you to understand that the values underneath everything that happened later with Bradley were not new values I discovered out of hurt feelings in a driveway. They were the same values I had lived by from the very first hard year of the business, that ownership carries genuine responsibility as its price, that a person who benefits from something is also accountable for it, and that the two things, benefit and accountability, are never supposed to come apart from each other, however convenient it might be, in a given season, to let them. By 2005 we'd moved into a proper facility, 4,000 square feet, 6 employees. By 2015 we'd landed our first aerospace subcontract, a genuinely difficult thing for a shop our size to earn, and by the time Bradley turned 30 in 2015, Voss Precision Machining had 31 employees, 2 long-term aerospace clients, and a reputation across 3 states for tolerances other shops couldn't consistently hit. I am telling you all of this because you need to understand exactly what kind of foundation I was standing on the day my son told me I was an embarrassment. I did not arrive in that driveway a helpless, aging man with nothing behind him. I arrived there as a man who had built something real, over 37 years, with his own 2 hands and a wife's steady bookkeeping beside him, and who had never once, not for a single day of it, handed the keys of that company to anyone else. Bradley joined the business in 2018, at 33, after 5 years working sales for a competitor across the state, a job he'd taken straight out of college partly, I believe now, out of a young man's need to prove he could succeed somewhere that wasn't simply handed to him by his father. I was proud of that instinct in him. I want you to know that. I never once wanted my son inside my company out of obligation. I wanted him there because he wanted to be there, and when he finally came to me in 2018 and asked whether there was a place for him, I said yes before he'd even finished the sentence. I gave him the title of general manager within his first year, faster than I should have, if I'm honest with you now. I gave him a company vehicle, a generous salary, and increasing authority over day-to-day operations, because he was sharp, genuinely sharp, better with the sales side of the business than I had ever been myself, and because I wanted, more than almost anything, to see my son succeed inside the thing I'd spent my whole life building. What I did not do, and this matters enormously to everything that follows, was ever transfer any actual ownership of the company to him. Voss Precision Machining remained, from the day I incorporated it in 1988 through the afternoon of the driveway confrontation I'm about to tell you about, 100% owned by me, Arthur Voss, sole shareholder, sole signatory on every corporate document, sole name on the deed to the building itself, which I had purchased outright in 2011. I want to explain why I never transferred ownership, because I think the reasoning matters. It was not distrust, not at first. Linda and I had simply always planned, in the vague way people plan things decades out, to handle succession properly when the time actually came, with a formal buy-sell agreement, proper valuation, the whole structure done right rather than rushed. But Bradley, over the 5 years he worked in the business, began speaking about the company in a way that started to concern me, slowly, the way a rattle in an engine starts quiet and gets steadily louder over months before you finally admit to yourself that something needs looking at. He began referring to it, in conversations with clients, with vendors, even once at a Chamber of Commerce dinner in front of 40 people, as my company. Not my father's company. Not Voss Precision Machining, which he was helping run. My company. I noticed it the first time in 2020, at a supplier lunch, when he told a vendor rep, casually, over appetizers, that he was looking at expanding into a new product line next year. My thinking is we pivot the whole shop floor by Q3. Not our thinking. Not a proposal he intended to bring to me. My thinking. As though the decision, and the company underneath it, were already entirely his to direct. I let it go the first several times. I told myself it was simply the confident language of a young man growing into a leadership role, the kind of harmless overstatement that happens in every family business when a son starts finding his footing. There was a second incident, in the spring of 2021, that I want to tell you about, because I think it shows how the pattern kept accumulating in small, easily excusable increments, the exact way these things always seem to accumulate. We had a new hire that spring, a young machinist named Danny Rees, and during his first week, Bradley walked him through the shop floor for his orientation. I happened to be nearby, checking a job on an adjacent mill, and I overheard Bradley telling Danny, with the easy authority of a man giving a new employee the lay of the land, that he'd started the company back in 2018 alongside his father, and that the two of them had built it up together from there. I want you to notice the specific distortion in that sentence, because I think it matters. Bradley had not started the company. He had joined a company that was already 30 years old, with an established client base, an established reputation, and an established owner, 3 years before Bradley ever walked through its doors. Started it together was not simply enthusiastic language. It was a genuine rewriting of the company's actual history, delivered to a brand new employee who had no way of knowing otherwise, and who would now, presumably, carry that rewritten history forward as simple fact for as long as he worked there. I did not correct Bradley in front of Danny that day. I told myself, at the time, that correcting my son in front of a brand new hire would be its own kind of embarrassment, an irony I did not appreciate until much later, given what Bradley would go on to say to me about embarrassment in front of others just over 2 years afterward. I mentioned it to him privately that evening instead, gently. The way you correct a small thing you hope is simply a slip of the tongue rather than a genuine belief. Bradley, I said, you might want to be careful with how you describe the company's history to new hires. I built this place for 30 years before you joined it. Bradley had laughed it off easily. Of course, Dad, he'd said, I just meant since I've been here. It feels like we built it together, you know what I mean. I let it go, because at the time, it genuinely did seem like nothing more than careless phrasing rather than a fixed belief. There was a third incident, in the fall of 2022, roughly 8 months before the buy-sell agreement was ultimately signed, that I think crystallized, in hindsight, exactly how far the pattern had already progressed by then, though I still did not fully act on it until the cookout finally forced the issue into the open. We had a minor dispute that fall with a metal supplier over a delayed shipment, and Bradley handled the negotiation himself, ultimately securing better terms for us going forward. At the following month's Chamber of Commerce dinner, in front of roughly 40 other local business owners, the Chamber's president asked Bradley to say a few words about the company's recent growth, an invitation extended, I want to be clear, specifically to me as the shop's owner, though delivered to Bradley by an organizer who had simply assumed, based on how Bradley had represented himself at previous events, that he was the person to ask. Bradley stood and spoke for nearly 5 minutes, describing the company's growth over the preceding several years with genuine enthusiasm and real command of the details, and I want to tell you that the substance of what he said was not inaccurate. The growth had genuinely happened, and his contributions to it had genuinely mattered. But not once, in those 5 minutes, did he mention that the company had existed for 30 years before he joined it, or that his father, sitting at the very same table, listening to every word, was the sole owner of the business being described. He spoke, from the podium, entirely in the voice of a principal describing his own company, and I sat at that table, in front of 40 people I did business with regularly, and said nothing, because correcting my own son publicly, at a formal dinner, in front of the Chamber of Commerce, felt like precisely the kind of embarrassment I did not want to create for either of us. I want you to notice, looking back, the strange symmetry in that decision. I stayed silent that night specifically to avoid embarrassing Bradley in public. 8 months later, he stood in our own driveway and told me that I was the one embarrassing him in public. I do not think he ever knew about my own silence that evening at the chamber dinner, the small accommodation I had made, quietly, to protect him from a correction I judged, at the time, would cost him more than it was worth. I have wondered many times since whether that accommodation, made with genuine good intentions, was itself one more small brick in the wall of misunderstanding that eventually became large enough to need the kind of formal, unavoidable correction that followed. I did not let it go entirely, though. Quietly, without ever discussing it with Bradley, I called an old friend of mine, an attorney named Gerald Whitfield, who had handled the company's legal work since 1995, and I asked him, in the fall of 2021, to review our corporate structure and make sure everything remained exactly as clean and exactly as solely mine as it had always been. Gerald, I said to him, sitting in his office that October afternoon, I don't think anything's wrong yet. I just want to make sure that if something ever did go wrong, the paperwork already protects me the way it's supposed to. Gerald had looked at me over his reading glasses, the way he always did when he was about to say something he thought I needed to hear plainly. Arthur, he said, in family businesses, 90% of the disasters I've seen over 30 years didn't start with a bad decision. They started with an assumption nobody ever bothered to correct out loud. If Bradley's been talking about this place like it's already his, and you haven't corrected him, that's not a small thing. That's the seed of exactly the kind of disaster you're asking me to help you prevent. We spent the following 2 months, that fall of 2021, formalizing exactly what I already technically had, but making it airtight in ways it hadn't quite been before. Gerald drew up a shareholder agreement specifying, in unambiguous language, that I retained 100% voting control and 100% equity ownership of Voss Precision Machining, that Bradley's role as general manager was an employment position, revocable at my sole discretion, carrying no ownership interest whatsoever unless and until a separate, formal buy-sell transaction was executed and signed by both parties. He also drew up a clause, at my specific request, addressing something I'd started to worry about after watching Bradley's language shift over those 3 years, a clause specifying that any attempt by an employee, including a family member, to publicly represent themselves as an owner or principal of the company without authorization would constitute grounds for immediate review of that employee's continued role, at my sole discretion as owner. I did not tell Bradley about any of this. I told Linda, because Linda deserved to know, and because I trusted her completely to hold the information without ever using it as a weapon in an argument she wasn't yet having. I did not tell my son, because I hoped, sincerely, that I would never actually need the protection I was quietly building, the same way a man installs a smoke detector hoping his house never once catches fire. I signed that agreement in December of 2021, nearly a year and a half before the afternoon in my driveway that I'm about to tell you about. Gerald filed the corporate documentation properly, and I went on running my ordinary life, early mornings at the shop, Sunday dinners with Bradley and his wife, Colleen, and their 2 kids, never once mentioning what Gerald and I had done, because I hoped, genuinely, that the paper would sit quietly in a drawer for the rest of my working life, never once needed. I need to tell you about the neighborhood cookout itself now, because the confrontation didn't come out of nowhere, and I think the setup matters as much as the moment itself. Every July, our street, Chatham Ridge, holds a block party, a tradition that goes back nearly 2 decades, organized loosely by a rotating handful of neighbors, potluck style, folding tables set up across 3 driveways, kids running through sprinklers while the adults stand around drinking beer out of coolers and talking about roof repairs and property taxes. Linda and I had hosted our portion of it more years than not, and Bradley, who lived 4 streets over with Colleen and the kids, always came, along with a fair number of his own friends from the neighborhood he'd grown up in. That particular July, on a Saturday afternoon hot enough that everyone had retreated at least partially into the shade, I was standing near my own garage with a paper plate of potato salad, talking with my neighbor Frank Delgado, a retired postal worker I'd known for 18 years, about a delivery schedule issue we'd had that week at the shop. One of our aerospace clients had pushed up a deadline unexpectedly, and I was mentioning, in the ordinary, unremarkable way you mention work things to a neighbor at a cookout, that we'd had to run a Saturday shift to make it happen. Bradley walked over partway through this conversation, a beer in his hand, Colleen a few steps behind him, and I noticed, though I didn't think much of it at the time, that his jaw was already set in a particular way I'd learned over the years to recognize as displeasure building towards something. Dad, he said, cutting into the conversation with Frank without any real greeting first, can I talk to you for a second? I excused myself from Frank, and Bradley walked me a few steps away, toward my own garage, lowering his voice in a way that somehow made it carry further rather than less far, the particular trick some people have of speaking quietly with an edge sharp enough that everyone nearby still hears it. Can you not do that? He said. Do what? I asked. Talk about work stuff like that. In front of everybody. You're standing there telling Frank Delgado about our Saturday shift schedule like he's a shareholder. People don't want to hear about production deadlines at a barbecue, Dad. It's embarrassing. I looked at my son for a long moment. I want to tell you honestly that my first reaction was simply confusion, the genuine confusion of a man who has just been told that an entirely ordinary conversation was somehow a source of shame to the person standing next to him. Bradley, I said, I was talking to Frank about a work problem the way I've talked to Frank about work problems for 18 years. He's not embarrassed. He asked me a question and I answered it. Bradley's jaw tightened further. That's not the point, Dad. The point is you standing around at a neighborhood party going on about production schedules like you're still, like this is your. He stopped himself, though not quite quickly enough, and something in the half-finished sentence sat there between us in the heat, unmistakable in its shape, even unfinished. Like it's still my what? I said quietly. Bradley's eyes flicked toward Colleen, then back to me, and I watched him recalibrate, the way I'd watched him recalibrate in business meetings 100 times, choosing the version of the sentence that sounded least damaging rather than the one that was actually true. Like you're still running the whole show, he said. I've got this handled, Dad. I've had it handled for years now. You don't need to be out here talking shop with the neighbors like you're still clocking in every morning at 6. It makes it look like, he gestured vaguely, and I understood, watching the gesture, that he genuinely did not have a comfortable way to finish that sentence either. Like what, Bradley? I said again, and I want you to notice that my voice had not risen at all. I was not shouting. I was simply, calmly, asking my son to finish a thought he clearly did not want to finish out loud, in front of the neighbors he just accused me of embarrassing him in front of. Like you're some kind of, he said, and then, finally, the whole sentence came out, the way a stuck valve finally releases all at once under pressure that's been building for longer than anyone standing nearby realized. Like you're some old guy who still thinks he runs a company, standing around bragging about production schedules because it's the only thing he's still got going for him. It's embarrassing, Dad. You're embarrassing us in front of the neighbors. Can you just relax and enjoy the barbecue like a normal person for once? The block party did not go silent, exactly, the way these confrontations sometimes do in the stories you hear. Life is rarely quite that theatrical. But Frank Delgado, standing 8 feet away, had clearly heard every word of it, and I saw him look down at his own paper plate with the particular studied concentration of a man pretending very hard not to have overheard something he very much overheard. Colleen's face had gone tight and uncomfortable, her eyes on the grass rather than on either of us. I looked at my son for a long moment. 39 years old, standing in front of me at a neighborhood cookout, having just told me, in front of a man I'd known for 18 years, that I was embarrassing in my own driveway, talking about a company that I had built from a single rented garage bay and a used lathe bought at auction, a company he had worked at for 5 years without ever once holding a single share of stock in it, though I understood. Standing there in the heat with a paper plate of potato salad going warm in my hand. That he had somehow, over those 5 years, come to believe otherwise so completely that the belief had simply become invisible to him, the way water is invisible to a fish. I hear you, Bradley, I said. I appreciate the clarity. Something in my tone must have registered as wrong to him, the way it always seems to when I say those exact words, because his eyes narrowed slightly, uncertain, the particular uncertainty of a person who has just won an argument, and is suddenly unsure why winning it doesn't feel the way he expected it to. But he said nothing further. He walked back toward the cooler with Colleen a moment later, and I stood alone by my own garage for a while, finishing potato salad I no longer had much appetite for, watching the ordinary rhythm of the block party continue around me as though nothing at all had shifted, though I knew, standing there, that something fundamental absolutely had. I want to tell you about a phone call I received 3 days after the cookout, before I move forward, because it changed the shape of how I understood the whole situation, and because I think it will surprise you the way it surprised me. The call came on a Tuesday evening from Colleen, Bradley's wife, whom I had always found warm and easy to talk with, though we had rarely, in 9 years of marriage to my son, discussed anything as directly personal as what she was about to say to me. "Arthur," she said, when I picked up, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it as coming from someone who loves Bradley very much, not someone trying to get in the middle of anything between you two." I told her I was listening. "I heard what he said to you Saturday," she said. I was standing right there. "And Arthur, I need you to know, I've been married to that man for 9 years, and I have watched him slowly start talking about that shop like it's already his for at least the last 2 of them. I've mentioned it to him privately, more than once, gently, the way a wife tries to mention things without starting a fight over them. He always brushed it off, told me I was overthinking it, that of course he knew whose company it technically was, he was just speaking casually. But Arthur, I don't think it was ever just casual. I think somewhere along the way he actually started believing it, and I've been worried for a while now about what would happen the day that belief finally ran into reality. I confess this surprised me. I had expected, if anyone called me at all in those first few days, that the call might be a plea on Bradley's behalf, an attempt to smooth over the tension before it hardened into something permanent. I had not expected an ally, quiet and unprompted, from inside my son's own household. "I raise this because I love him," Colleen continued, "and because I think you're the only person who can actually correct it in a way he'll finally hear. I can tell him 100 times that the shop isn't his yet. It doesn't land the same way coming from a wife as it does coming from the man who actually built it. I hope whatever you do next, you do it clearly enough that he can't quietly talk himself back around it the way he always has with me." I thanked her, genuinely moved by the call, though I want to be honest with you that it also added a certain weight to what I already knew I needed to do. It is one thing to act on your own private observation of a pattern. It is another thing entirely to learn that the people closest to the situation, people who love your son as much as you do, have already seen the same thing plainly, and have simply been waiting, patiently, and without much hope, for someone with real standing to finally address it. I want to tell you also about the shop floor itself during that uncertain week Bradley took off, because I think it matters to understanding exactly how deep the misunderstanding had actually run. Several of our longer-tenured employees, men and women who had worked at Voss Precision Machining for over a decade, came to me individually that week, in the careful, understated way shop floor employees often approach a sensitive subject, to ask, in one form or another, whether everything was all right between me and Bradley. Our shop foreman, a steady, quiet man named Ruben Castillo who had been with me since 2003, stopped by my office on the Wednesday of that week, ostensibly to discuss a tooling order, and lingered a moment after the actual business was finished. "Mr. Voss," he said, "and I want you to know, I don't say this to stir anything up. But some of the guys have noticed, over the last year or two, Bradley's started talking about the shop like his opinion is the final word on things, even on stuff you'd normally weigh in on yourself. Nobody's said anything, because it's not really our place. But I figured, given he's out this week, maybe it's worth you knowing that some of us noticed the same thing you must have noticed too." I thanked Ruben for his honesty, and I want to tell you that hearing it from him, a man with no personal stake in the family dynamics at play, no motive beyond simple loyalty to a shop he'd given 2 decades of his working life to, confirmed something for me that I had, until that week, only half allowed myself to fully believe, that the pattern I'd corrected in Bradley was not something I had imagined or overreacted to, but something plainly visible to nearly everyone around him except, until that Saturday morning at my kitchen table, Bradley himself. I need to stop here for a moment, because what happened over the following week is the part one think matters most, and I don't want to rush past it. If you're still with me, drop the number 31 in the comments. That's how many employees were at the shop that summer, so I know you're still sitting with me through this. Fair warning, The story from here weaves in a few more fictional elements to bring the truth of it to life clearly. If that's not the kind of telling you're looking for, this is a fine place to step away, with my full respect. For those staying, let's keep going. I did not confront Bradley again that day. I went home that evening, sat with Linda at our kitchen table, the same table we'd kept the company's books on decades earlier, and I told her exactly what had happened in the driveway, word for word, as close as I could remember it. Linda had been quiet for a long moment after I finished, turning her coffee cup slowly between her hands. "Arthur," she finally said, "I've watched that boy talk about the shop like it's already his for 3 years now, and I kept telling myself it was just confidence. But confidence doesn't tell his own father to relax and enjoy the barbecue like a normal person in front of the neighbors. That's not confidence. That's a man who has genuinely forgotten, somewhere along the way, that the thing he's talking about was never his to be embarrassed on behalf of in the first place." I told her about Gerald, about the shareholder agreement we'd quietly formalized 18 months earlier, and Linda nodded slowly, unsurprised, because I had told her at the time and she had simply, in her practical way, filed the information away without ever needing to discuss it further until a moment like this one actually arrived. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I need to think," I told her. "I don't want to act out of anger. I want to act out of clarity, and right now I'm still mostly angry." I did not call Bradley that week. I went to the shop Monday morning as I always did, and I noticed, watching him move through his own day with the easy, settled confidence of a man who believed the driveway conversation had been fully resolved in his favor, that nothing in his demeanor toward me had shifted at all. He greeted me the same way he always did. He asked my opinion on a vendor quote the same way he always did. He genuinely seemed to believe, as best I could tell, that the incident was closed, filed away as an ordinary bit of family friction rather than as the moment it actually was. I went to see Gerald Whitfield that Wednesday, sitting across from him at the same desk where we formalized the shareholder agreement 18 months earlier. "Gerald," I said, "I think it's time to actually use what we built." Gerald had listened to the full story of the cookout without interrupting, the way he always did, letting me finish completely before he said anything at all. When I was done, he sat back in his chair and was quiet for a moment. "Arthur," he said, "I want to make sure I understand exactly what you're asking for before we do anything. The agreement we drew up 18 months ago already protects your ownership completely. Nothing that happened at that cookout changes your legal position one bit. You were never at any risk of losing anything on paper. What I think you're actually asking me is something different. You're asking whether it's time to make Bradley understand, plainly and unmistakably, exactly whose company this is, in a way he can no longer quietly misunderstand." "That's exactly it," I said. Gerald considered this for a long moment. "There's a way to do that cleanly," he said, "and I think, given what you've told me, it may genuinely be the kindest thing you can do for him at this point, even though it won't feel kind in the moment. We formally document his position, in writing, delivered directly to him, laying out his actual employment status, his actual authority, and specifically, his complete lack of any ownership stake, current or promised. And we pair it with something else, something I think matters just as much as the legal clarity itself. We give him a genuine, real path toward actual ownership, structured properly, with real terms, real vesting, real accountability, but starting from zero, from an honest baseline, rather than from the invisible assumption he's apparently been building his whole identity on for 3 years. I sat with that for a long moment. I want you to understand that I did not arrive at my next decision easily. I had spent 5 years watching my son grow into the business with genuine pride, and the prospect of the conversation Gerald was describing filled me with a specific, complicated dread that had very little to do with anger, and everything to do with grief for a version of this relationship I had hoped we never need to have out loud. "Draft it," I told Gerald. "I want it done properly, formally, with real terms attached, not just a correction. I want him to walk away from this conversation understanding exactly where he stands, and exactly what an honest path forward would actually look like, if he wants to take it." Gerald drew up the documentation over the following 10 days. It specified, in plain, Unambiguous language, Bradley's actual role at Voss Precision Machining as an at-will general manager, employed by, and entirely subordinate to, the sole owner and principal, Arthur Voss. It specified that he held no equity, no voting rights, no ownership claim of any kind, past or implied. And attached to it, exactly as Gerald had proposed, was a genuine buy-sell proposal, a structured path over 8 years by which Bradley could earn actual equity in the company, tied to performance benchmarks, tied to a real purchase price based on independent valuation, tied to demonstrated leadership rather than assumed inheritance. I called Bradley on a Thursday evening, 2 weeks after the cookout, and asked him to come by the house Saturday morning, alone, without Colleen, to talk something through. He arrived Saturday at 9, still faintly cheerful, still entirely unaware that anything about the driveway conversation 2 weeks earlier had shifted anything at all in how I now understood our relationship. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Linda and I had discussed this only 10 days earlier, and I slid Gerald's folder across to him without much preamble. "What's this?" he asked, and I watched, the same way I imagine most fathers in stories like this one watch, the particular slow drain of confidence that happens when a person begins reading something they did not expect and cannot yet fully parse. "Read it," I said. He read it. It took him nearly 10 minutes, going back over certain pages more than once, and I watched his face shift through several distinct stages. Confusion first, then something like disbelief, then, finally, a kind of stunned stillness that told me he had genuinely, completely understood, for what may have been the first time in 5 years, exactly what his actual legal position at the company had always been. "Dad," he finally said, his voice quieter than I'd heard it in a long time, "this says I don't own anything. Not a share. Not a percentage. Nothing." "That's correct," I said. "You never have. You've worked here for 5 years as an employee, a very good one, and I've been proud of the job you've done. But you have never, not for one single day, owned any part of this company, because we never once sat down and formally transferred any ownership to you. I let that assumption sit uncorrected for longer than I should have, and I take responsibility for that. But Bradley, I need you to hear something else, and I need you to hear it clearly, because it matters more than the correction itself. 2 weeks ago, in our own driveway, in front of Frank Delgado and half the neighborhood, you told me I was embarrassing to be around because I was talking about production schedules at a company you apparently believe is already yours. You told your own father to relax and enjoy the barbecue like a normal person, as though I were an aging embarrassment standing around bragging about a business that has nothing to do with me. That company put a roof over your head for your entire childhood. It's paying for the roof over your own children's heads right now, through the salary I pay you. And you stood in front of neighbors I've known for 18 years and treated me like an old man who'd forgotten his place in something that was never yours to begin with." Bradley's face had gone pale, and I watched his hand tighten around the edge of the folder. "Dad," he said, "I didn't mean it like—" He stopped, the way people often do when they realize, mid-sentence, that the explanation they were about to offer isn't actually going to hold up to scrutiny. "How did you mean it?" I asked, and I kept my voice level, though it cost me more than I let show. "I don't know," he said, and for the first time in a long while, I heard something genuinely uncertain in my son's voice, rather than the settled, easy confidence he'd carried for years. "I think I'd been running the day-to-day of this place for so long, I stopped thinking of it as anything other than mine. I didn't do that on purpose. I don't think I even noticed I was doing it." "That may well be true," I said. "But noticing it now doesn't undo what you said in that driveway, or the 3 years of conversations before it where I let the same assumptions slide by uncorrected. I want you to understand something clearly, Bradley, because I'm only going to say it once. This document isn't a punishment. It's the truth, finally written down, about a company that has only ever had one owner. What's attached to it is a genuine offer, a real path to actual ownership, earned honestly, starting from today rather than from an assumption you built without ever once asking me directly whether it was true. Whether you take that path is entirely up to you. But I will not spend the rest of my working life standing in my own driveway being told to act normal about a business I built with my own 2 hands, by a son who has never once held a single share of it. Bradley sat with that for a long time, staring down at the folder, and I did not fill the silence, because I have learned, over the years, that some silences need to be sat inside fully before either party tries to speak past them. "I don't know what to say, Dad," he finally said. "I think I need some time with this." "Take the time you need," I told him. "The offer in that folder doesn't expire this week, or this month. It'll be there whenever you're ready to actually engage with it honestly, if you decide you want to." I need to pause here, because what happened over the following months surprised me more than almost anything else in this whole story, and I don't want you to miss it. Type 9 in the comments if you want to hear the rest. I'll know you're still with me. And one more note. The chapters ahead carry a few more fictionalized elements woven in for the telling. If that's not what you came here for, this is a fine place to step away, with my respect. For those staying, let's continue. Bradley did not come to the shop the following Monday. He called in, telling the front office he was taking some personal time, and I want to be honest with you that the 4 days that followed were some of the most uncertain of my entire adult life, far more uncertain, oddly, than the driveway confrontation itself had been. I did not know, sitting in my own office that week, running the shop floor essentially alone the way I had decades earlier, whether my son would come back at all, whether the correction I'd delivered had landed as the honest reset I'd intended it to be, or whether it had simply confirmed, in his mind, some grievance against me that had been quietly accumulating for longer than I'd understood. I learned, much later, what Bradley had actually done with those 4 days, once enough trust had rebuilt between us that he could tell me honestly without either of us treating it as a fresh accusation. He had not, as I half feared at the time, spent that week nursing a grievance against me, or consulting an attorney of his own to explore whether he had any claim to challenge. He had spent most of it alone, driving, he told me, out to the lake his family used to rent a cabin at when he was a boy, sitting by the water for long stretches with no particular plan, trying to trace back, in his own mind, exactly when he had started believing something about the company that had never actually been true. "I kept trying to find the day it happened, Dad," he told me, nearly a year later, sitting on my own back porch on an ordinary Sunday evening. "Like there'd be one specific moment I could point to and say, that's when I started thinking of it as mine. And I never found one." I think that's what actually scared me the most that week. It wasn't one bad decision. It was just years of nobody, including me, ever bothering to say the true thing out loud, until it quietly turned into something false that I'd built half my identity on without ever once checking whether it was actually true. He told me he had called Colleen only once during those 4 days, on the second night, not to vent about the folder, but simply to ask her, plainly, whether she had genuinely believed, all along, that he didn't own any part of the shop. "I remember what she said," he told me. "She said, Bradley, I've been telling you gently for 2 years that you talk about it like it's yours. I didn't think you were lying. I think you'd just genuinely forgotten it wasn't, and I didn't know how to make you remember without you getting defensive about it." He'd sat with that answer, he told me, for a long time that night, turning it over the way a man turns over a piece of information he suspects has been true and available to him for a long while, if only he'd been willing to actually hear it. I want to tell you also about a conversation I'd had with Gerald Whitfield much earlier, back in the fall of 2021 when we first formalized the shareholder agreement, because I think it illuminates something about how deliberately I had actually been watching this situation develop, long before the cookout ever happened. "Arthur," Gerald had said to me that October afternoon, after we'd finished drafting the initial documents, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to actually think about it rather than answering reflexively. Do you think Bradley is a bad son? Because everything you've described to me today sounds like a good employee slowly drifting into a bad assumption, not like a young man deliberately scheming against his own father." I had told Gerald, honestly, that no, I did not believe Bradley was a bad son, and that I did not believe, even then, that anything he'd said or done had come from genuine malice. "I think he's a good son who's been allowed to believe something comfortable for too long," I told Gerald, "and I think comfortable beliefs, left uncorrected, eventually curdle into something that looks a great deal like entitlement, even in people who never set out to become entitled at all." Gerald had nodded slowly at that, the way he always did when he thought a client had actually arrived at something true. "Then that's good news, Arthur," he'd said. "Because the paperwork we're drafting today isn't really built for a bad son. It's built for a good one who might need, someday, a very clear and very honest wake-up call. If you're right about him, and I suspect you are, this folder will do exactly what it's meant to do, and it'll do it without permanently damaging the relationship underneath it. But Arthur, I want to say one more thing, because I think it matters. However this eventually plays out, whenever it plays out, don't deliver that folder out of anger in the moment. Deliver it once you're calm enough that Bradley can actually hear the honesty in it, rather than just the sting. I have thought about Gerald's advice many times since, particularly in the 2 weeks I let pass between the cookout itself and the Saturday morning I finally sat Bradley down at my kitchen table. I did not act in the heat of that driveway conversation, however tempting it might have been in the moment. I waited, deliberately, until I was calm enough to deliver the correction the way Gerald had described, clearly, honestly, without cruelty, in a way my son could actually receive rather than simply defend himself against. Linda, for her part, occupied a steadier position than I did that week, and I think her steadiness deserves its own telling, because without it, I'm not entirely sure I would have held my own resolve as clearly as I did. "Arthur," she said to me on the second night of that week, sitting across from me at the kitchen table while I turned a cold cup of coffee slowly between my hands, "you did the right thing, and I need you to actually believe that this week, not just say it. That boy has been walking around for 3 years thinking a company he doesn't own is somehow an extension of his own identity, and the driveway wasn't the first time it showed. It was just the first time it showed loud enough that you couldn't quietly file it away as harmless anymore. Whatever he decides to do with the folder, you did not create this problem by finally naming it. You created this problem, if anyone did, 39 years ago, letting a little boy believe the whole world would always be softened for him. Naming it now is the closest thing to a fix you're ever going to get to offer him." I sat with those words for a long while that night, the same way I've had to sit with a great many hard truths across this whole ordeal. Bradley returned to the shop the following Monday, a week after our kitchen table conversation, and I want to tell you that the man who walked back through those doors was noticeably different from the man who had walked out a week earlier, though the difference was subtle enough that I don't think anyone else on the floor particularly noticed it. He came to my office first thing, before he'd even gone to his own desk, and sat down across from me. "Dad," he said, "I've spent the whole week thinking about this, and I need to say some things, and I need you to just let me get through them before you respond, because I've been rehearsing this in my head for days and I'm scared if you interrupt me I'll lose my nerve." I told him to go ahead. "I've been telling myself a story for 3 years," he said, "that isn't true. I told myself I built this place up, that the growth we've had since I joined is mine, that the clients I brought in are mine, that somehow the fact that I run the day-to-day means the whole thing is functionally mine even if the paperwork says otherwise. And I think somewhere in there I stopped seeing you as the man who actually built this from a garage bay with a used lathe, and started seeing you as, I don't know, an obstacle. An old-timer still hanging around a place that had already become mine in every way that mattered to me." He stopped, his jaw working for a moment before he continued. "And that's an ugly thing to say out loud about my own father, but it's the truth, and I think you deserve to hear me say it plainly rather than dance around it the way I've been dancing around it in my own head all week." I did not respond immediately. I let him sit inside that admission for a moment, the way I've learned some admissions need to be sat inside before either party moves the conversation forward. "Thank you for saying that," I finally told him. "I mean that. I know it costs you something to say it plainly." He nodded, his eyes wet though he wasn't crying outright, holding the emotion at the edge the way people do when they're trying to stay composed enough to keep talking. "I want the path in that folder," he said. "The real one. Starting from zero, earn honestly, however long it takes. I don't want to feel like this place is mine because I've convinced myself it is. I want to actually earn owning part of it, the way you did, so that when I finally do own a piece of it, it's real, and I know it's real, and I never again stand in front of anyone, especially you, acting like something that isn't mine yet already belongs to me. I want to tell you that hearing my son say those words did something to the tight place behind my ribs that had been aching since the driveway confrontation 5 weeks earlier. It did not undo the pain of that afternoon. But it told me, plainly, that the correction had landed the way I'd hoped it would, rather than the way I'd feared it might. I want to tell you about the day we actually signed the formal buy-sell agreement, because it was a smaller, quieter moment than you might expect, given everything that had led up to it, and I think its quietness itself says something worth telling. We met in Gerald's office on a Tuesday morning, the three of us, Gerald behind his same scarred desk, Bradley and I sitting across from him the way I had sat across from Gerald alone 18 months earlier when we'd first formalized my sole ownership. Linda came too, though she had no formal role in the signing itself, simply because I asked her to be there, and because I think both Bradley and I understood, without either of us saying so directly, that her presence in the room mattered to how the moment would feel afterward. Gerald walked through the document page by page, the vesting schedule, the performance benchmarks, the independent valuation methodology, and Bradley asked several genuinely thoughtful questions along the way, the kind of questions a man asks when he actually intends to hold himself accountable to an agreement rather than simply sign it and move on. At one point, reviewing the performance benchmarks tied to the second year of vesting, Bradley looked up and asked whether the targets could be adjusted if a genuine market downturn made them unreasonably difficult to hit through no fault of his own management. Gerald had looked to me before answering, the way he always did when a question touched a decision that was rightfully mine rather than his to make unilaterally. I told Bradley, honestly, that I thought that was a fair question, and that we could build in a reasonable adjustment clause tied to an independent industry benchmark, so that he would be judged against realistic market conditions rather than an arbitrary fixed number regardless of circumstances beyond his control. I want you to notice something about that exchange, because I think it mattered. A year earlier, I do not believe Bradley would have asked that question at all, because a year earlier, he had not yet learned to distinguish between a fair adjustment, honestly negotiated, and simply expecting the terms to bend around him because he found them inconvenient. The question itself, carefully reasoned and reasonably argued, was its own small proof of exactly how much had already begun shifting in him. We signed the document a little after 11 that morning. There was no particular ceremony to it, no handshake photograph, nothing that would have made for a dramatic scene in a shorter telling of this story. Bradley simply signed his name on the final page, set down the pen, and sat quietly for a moment, looking at his own signature. "Dad," he said, "this is the first document I've ever signed at this company that actually has my name on it in a way that means something. Everything else, my job title, my business cards, all of it, none of that was ever really mine until right now. I want you to know I understand the difference now, and I'm grateful you made me actually learn it instead of just letting me keep assuming it." Linda, sitting quietly beside me through the whole signing, reached over and squeezed my hand at that, and I understood, without either of us needing to say anything more, that she was thinking exactly what I was thinking, that whatever this year had cost all of us, the moment sitting in front of us in Gerald's office that Tuesday morning had been worth every difficult hour it took to arrive at. The agreement itself was structured exactly as Gerald had proposed months earlier, an 8-year vesting path, tied to specific, measurable performance benchmarks, tied to a real, independently appraised purchase price, requiring Bradley to actually purchase his growing stake in the company with his own earned capital rather than simply receiving it as an inheritance he'd assumed all along. I want to be clear that I did not make this path easy for him. I made it real, which is a different thing entirely, and I believe now, watching the 2 years that have passed since that agreement was signed, that the realness of it has mattered more to Bradley's genuine growth as a leader than any amount of easy inheritance ever could have. I want to tell you honestly that the year following the buy-sell agreement was not a smooth, uninterrupted climb toward reconciliation, however tidy that might sound in a shorter telling of this story. It happened in fits and starts, with real setbacks along the way, and I think you deserve the fuller, messier shape of it, because I suspect a good number of you listening tonight are somewhere in the middle of a similar process yourselves, and a falsely clean picture wouldn't serve you. The first real test came about 4 months after the agreement was signed, in the form of a genuine crisis rather than a manufactured one. One of our 2 aerospace clients, a company called Halloran Systems that represented nearly a quarter of our annual revenue, notified us on a Tuesday morning that a batch of precision housings we'd delivered the previous month had failed a secondary tolerance inspection on their end. A serious problem that risked not only the immediate contract but our entire standing as a certified supplier for aerospace work going forward. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because it mattered enormously to what happened next. My old instinct, the instinct built over 37 years of being the final word on every serious problem the company ever faced, was to step in immediately, take direct control of the crisis response, and manage Halloran's engineering team myself the way I would have without hesitation 2 years earlier. I did not do that. I sat with the discomfort of not doing that, standing in my own office doorway watching Bradley take the call from Halloran's quality manager, and I let him run the response himself. From the initial call through the root cause investigation through the corrective action plan he ultimately presented back to their engineering team 6 days later. I want to tell you that those 6 days were among the hardest of the entire year for me, not because I doubted Bradley's competence exactly, but because watching your own child carry the full weight of a genuine crisis, without stepping in to soften it for him the way you always used to, requires a specific and uncomfortable kind of restraint that I had spent decades never actually needing to practice. Bradley came to my office on the evening of the 6th day, exhausted, his tie loosened, a folder of root cause documentation under his arm. "Dad," he said, sitting down heavily across from me, "I think I fixed it. Halloran's accepting the corrective action plan. We're keeping the contract. But Dad, I want to tell you something." Somewhere around day 3 of this, standing in that conference room with their engineering team asking me questions I didn't have immediate answers for, I kept thinking about what I would have done a year ago. I think a year ago I would have called you the moment things got hard, and let you handle it, and then told everyone afterward that I'd handled it myself. This time I actually had to handle it myself, because I'd already told you I wanted the path that was real rather than the path that was easy, and I couldn't very well ask you to bail me out of the very first genuine test of it. I did not tell him, in that moment, how close I had come to stepping in anyway, how many times over those 6 days I had picked up my phone intending to call Halloran's engineering director directly before setting it back down, reminding myself, each time, that the entire point of the agreement Gerald and I had drafted was precisely this: a real test, with real consequences, that Bradley would need to genuinely earn his way through rather than have quietly smoothed over by a father unwilling to watch his son actually struggle. "I'm proud of you," I told him instead, and I meant it completely. "That's exactly what earning something looks like, Bradley. Not that it goes easily. That you carry it through anyway, even when it's hard, even when the easier path was sitting right there waiting for you to take it." There was a second, smaller test that spring, less dramatic than the Halloran crisis but, in its own way, more revealing of exactly how much had genuinely shifted in my son. We had a disagreement, a real one, over whether to invest in a piece of new equipment Bradley wanted to purchase for the shop floor, a 5-year-old but well-maintained 5-axis mill that would have allowed us to bid on a category of work we'd previously had to turn away. I disagreed with the timing of the purchase, believing our cash reserves were better held in reserve for another 2 quarters given some uncertainty in one of our supply contracts. The old Bradley, the Bradley of the driveway confrontation, would have, I believe, simply proceeded with the purchase on his own authority, the way he had grown accustomed to proceeding with most operational decisions over his 5 years at the company, treating my objection as a formality to be acknowledged rather than a genuine veto to be respected. This Bradley did not do that. He came back to me 3 days after our initial disagreement, having pulled together additional financial projections, and made his case again, more carefully, with real data rather than simply his own confident instinct, and when I still expressed reservations about the timing, he said something that told me, more clearly than almost anything else that year, exactly how much had genuinely changed in him. "Dad," he said, "I still think I'm right about this, and I'm going to keep making the case for it. But it's your call, not mine, and I'm not going to make an end run around that just because I'm frustrated you're not seeing it my way yet. That's not how this works anymore, and honestly, I don't want it to work that way anymore either. We held off on the equipment purchase for 2 more quarters, exactly as I'd wanted, and made it in the end almost precisely as Bradley had originally proposed, though by then with a stronger cash position underneath it that made the decision considerably less risky than it would have been in the spring. I want to tell you that watching my son argue his case honestly, accept a decision he disagreed with gracefully, and continue building his argument through legitimate means rather than simply working around me, taught me something about how genuinely the correction from that driveway confrontation had actually taken root in him. I want to tell you about one more moment from that year, because I think it rounds out the picture of exactly how much shifted, not just in Bradley, but in how the two of us related to each other going forward. It was late autumn, roughly 9 months after the buy-sell agreement was signed, and Bradley asked if I would come to a client dinner with him, one of our newer accounts, a mid-sized defense contractor we'd been courting for several months. He asked me to come not as the owner overseeing the negotiation, he was careful to clarify, but simply because he wanted my read on the client's engineering director, whose technical concerns Bradley suspected ran deeper than the man was willing to say outright in a formal meeting. I want you to understand what that request actually represented. A year earlier, Bradley would not have invited me to that dinner at all, or if he had, it would have been out of a kind of performative courtesy rather than a genuine desire for my input. This time, he asked because he genuinely wanted a second, more experienced set of eyes on a problem he suspected he wasn't yet equipped to fully read on his own, and he was comfortable enough, finally, in his own developing authority to ask for that help without it feeling to him like an admission of failure. The dinner went well. I noticed, over appetizers, exactly the hesitation in the engineering director's tone that Bradley had suspected was there, a quiet concern about our shop's capacity for a particular category of tight-tolerance work that the man wasn't quite willing to raise directly in front of his own procurement colleagues. I mentioned it to Bradley afterward, in the parking lot, and watched him nod slowly, filing the information away the way a genuinely capable manager files away a useful read on a client, rather than the way an insecure one dismisses an observation that didn't originate with him. "Thanks, Dad," he said, unlocking his car. "I wouldn't have caught that on my own." "I'm glad you were there. I want to tell you about one particular moment, roughly a year after the buy-sell agreement was signed, because I think it captures, better than almost anything else I could tell you, exactly how much genuinely shifted in my son over that year. We held our annual Chatham Ridge block party again that following July, almost exactly 1 year after the confrontation that started all of this. Frank Delgado was there again, the same neighbor who'd overheard the entire exchange the year before, and at some point in the afternoon, standing near my garage with a paper plate of the same potato salad, I found myself once again discussing a work matter with him, a new equipment purchase we were considering for the shop floor, nothing especially remarkable. Just the ordinary shop talk of a man discussing his life's work with a neighbor who happened to ask a genuine question about it. Bradley walked over partway through this conversation, and I confess I felt, for just a moment, the old tightening in my chest, the anticipation of a correction I'd braced myself against for a full year without ever quite admitting I was still bracing for it. Instead, Bradley simply joined the conversation. "Actually, Dad," he said, easily, naturally, "we should talk to Frank's brother-in-law about that equipment too. Didn't he used to work for a supplier that handles that exact model?" And the conversation continued, ordinary and unremarkable, 3 men standing in a driveway on a hot July afternoon discussing machinery, and Bradley's presence in it carried none of the tension, none of the barely concealed embarrassment, that had defined the same driveway exactly 1 year earlier. Later that evening, after most of the neighbors had gone home and the folding tables had been broken down, Bradley found me alone in my own garage, putting away a few stray folding chairs. "Dad," he said, "do you remember what I said to you in this exact spot last year?" I told him I remembered it clearly. "I think about it a lot," he said. "Not in a way that makes me feel terrible anymore, exactly, though it did for a long while. I think about it now mostly as the moment I actually started becoming someone worth being proud of, instead of just someone who assumed he already deserved to be proud of himself. I don't know if that makes sense. But I wanted you to know that I don't resent that folder you handed me last summer. I think it's the most important thing you've ever given me, and I think I understand now why it had to come the way it did, in the middle of an ordinary Saturday, instead of some easier moment where I could have talked my way around it. I did not have an immediate response to that, the way I have found, again and again across this whole ordeal, that some of the most honest things my son has ever said to me simply required silence from me before they required an answer. Thank you for telling me that, I finally said. I think I needed to hear it about as much as you needed to say it. I want to tell you about one more thread from that period, before I bring this to a close, because I think it matters to the fuller shape of the story. Bradley and Colleen have 2 children, a daughter named Iris, who was 11 the summer of the cookout, and a younger son, Theo, who was 7. I want to tell you about a conversation I had with Iris, roughly 8 months after the driveway confrontation, because children, I've found, often see the shape of a family's situation more clearly than the adults inside it give them credit for. Iris had come by the shop one Saturday morning with Bradley. One of the occasional weekends he brought her along to see the shop floor, something he'd started doing more deliberately since the buy-sell agreement, wanting her, I think, to understand the actual, tangible work behind the company in a way that had never quite been modeled for her before. She found me in my office while Bradley was out on the floor checking a job, and she asked me, with the particular directness that 11-year-olds sometimes have, whether Dad and I were okay now. I asked her what she meant by now, curious what version of the story had made its way to her. I heard Dad and Mom talking about it once, she said. About some paper you gave him, and how upset he was for a while, and then how he said it was actually good, later. I didn't really get all of it. But I wanted to know if you guys were okay. I told her, as honestly as I knew how to tell an 11-year-old something like this, that her father and I had gone through a hard patch, the kind that happens sometimes in families, and that we had come out the other side of it in a better place than we'd been before it happened, even though getting there had been difficult for both of us. Iris had considered this for a moment, the way children do when they're testing an adult explanation against their own private observations. He seems happier now, actually, she finally said. Like, at dinner and stuff. He used to get kind of tense whenever anybody asked him about work, like he had to prove something. He doesn't really do that anymore. I did not have an immediate response to that, the way I have found, again and again, that the most honest observations in this whole story have often come from the people least invested in managing how the situation appeared to anyone else. I want to tell you also about Linda's role in that year, because I think her steadiness deserves more than the passing mention I gave it earlier. Linda has never once, in over 4 decades of marriage, been a woman inclined toward dramatic gestures or grand pronouncements. Her strength has always shown itself in small, consistent things, the same way it showed itself in 1992, keeping the books steady through our hardest year, and the same way it showed itself throughout that difficult year with Bradley, simply by remaining the same patient, clear-eyed presence at our kitchen table regardless of which direction the week's news happened to be pointing. She had a small health scare that winter, roughly 6 months after the driveway confrontation, a cardiac arrhythmia that put her in the hospital overnight for observation, nothing ultimately serious, resolved with a minor medication adjustment, but frightening enough in the moment that our whole family gathered at the hospital that evening, Bradley and Colleen included. I want to tell you about something Bradley did that night, because I think it mattered more to our reconciliation than almost any single conversation we had that year. He did not, as I might once have expected from the version of him at the cookout, spend the evening managing the situation, directing doctors, asserting himself as the man handling things. He simply sat beside me in the hospital waiting room for 4 hours, mostly in silence, occasionally getting me a coffee from the vending machine down the hall without being asked, present in the specific, undemanding way a son is present for a father during a genuinely frightening night, without any need to prove anything to anyone in the room. Somewhere around midnight, waiting for the cardiologist to come back with an update, Bradley said quietly, "Dad, I keep thinking, if something had happened to Mom tonight, the last real conversation of substance you and I would have had before it was that folder on the kitchen table. And I know that's not really what matters right now, but I'm glad it's not the last real conversation we've had since then either. I'm glad we've had this whole year instead. Linda came home from the hospital the following afternoon, entirely stable, and I want to tell you that the fear of that night, brief and ultimately unfounded as it turned out to be, had its own strange gift buried inside it. It reminded both Bradley and me, plainly and without any need for further words, exactly how much the reconciliation of that year actually mattered. Set against how quickly and unexpectedly a family can run out of time to have the hard conversations that matter most. I want to tell you about one final conversation, this one with Gerald Whitfield, roughly 2 years after the original driveway confrontation, not long before I decided to sit down and record all of this for you tonight. We were having our own version of the Tuesday morning coffee ritual I imagine many of you have heard me describe in other tellings, sitting in his office on Cumberland Street, and Gerald asked me, in the particular careful way he asks most things, whether I'd ever second-guessed the decision to correct Bradley as formally as I had, rather than simply addressing it with a private, informal conversation. Arthur, he said, I drafted a lot of documents like that folder over 30 years of practice, and I'll tell you honestly, more than half the time, the family never recovers the way yours has. The correction lands, the ownership gets clarified, and the relationship stays permanently a little colder afterward, a little more transactional, like something genuinely broke that legal clarity alone couldn't quite repair. I've always wondered what made the difference in the cases where it actually worked the way it worked for you and Bradley. I thought about his question for a long moment before I answered. I think, I finally told him, the difference is whether the correction comes wrapped only in consequence, or whether it also comes wrapped in a genuine path forward. If I'd simply handed Bradley that folder and left it at that, I think you're right, Gerald, I think we'd have ended up exactly where those other families of yours ended up. But I didn't just tell him what he didn't have. I handed him a real, honest way to actually earn what he wanted, starting from the truth instead of from an assumption. I think that's the part that actually made the difference. Correction without a path forward is just punishment. Correction with a real path forward is something closer to an invitation, even when it doesn't feel that way in the moment you're handing it over. Gerald had nodded slowly at that, the particular nod of a man filing away something he intended to remember for the next family that walked into his office with a similar problem. That's a good way to put it, Arthur, he said. I think I'll borrow that the next time I need it. If there is a lesson in this story, and I believe there is one, it is this. A father who builds something real with his own 2 hands does not owe an apology for insisting that his children understand, plainly and honestly, exactly what they do and do not yet own, in a business or in a life. Love does not require a man to let his own children believe a false story about themselves, however comfortable that false story might feel in the moment, because a false story about what you've earned always collects its debt eventually, and it is kinder, in the long run, to correct it early and honestly than to let it grow large enough that the correction, when it finally comes, costs far more than it ever needed to. I believe a business built honestly deserves an honest accounting, even when that accounting has to be delivered to someone you love more than almost anything else in the world. I believe the deed to what you've built should always, in the end, say clearly whose name is actually on it, regardless of who else has quietly begun to assume otherwise. If any part of this story stayed with you tonight, tell me in the comments. I read every one. If someone you know is quietly living inside an assumption about something that was never actually theirs, share this with them gently. It costs you nothing, and it might be exactly the correction they need to hear, delivered with more grace than I managed to deliver mine at first. Subscribe if you'd like to stay close. There is more of this family's story worth telling. Thank you, truly, for staying with me all the way to the end. One final note before you go. The chapters in this telling carry fictionalized elements woven in to bring a human truth to life more clearly. If that isn't the kind of content you're looking for, no hard feelings at all, choose what serves you, and take good care of yourself.